And right now it's time to welcome our first guest, economist Peter Morici. Peter's a business professor at the University of Maryland and also the former chief economist for the U.S. International Trade Commission. And you can follow Peter on Twitter at pmorici1. Peter, as always a pleasure, as a friend of the income generation, thanks once again for being here with us on the show.
Nice to be with you.
So, okay, we spoke back in May about the economy, and at that point, you were pretty positive about the direction the economy is going, that we could stave off recession for at least a couple of years. Obviously, some things have happened over the last few months that may change your thinking. So has anything changed in your thinking about the economy in general? And if so, what are the biggest triggers that have caused that change?
Well, I think we're at greater risk in Europe and in Asia. And, everybody's pointing at the trade war. But in reality, there are dysfunctions in the European economy, in the Euro system, which are causing Brexit and the yellow jackets and so forth in France. And they're not getting addressed. It's going to be difficult long term to keep the U.S. economy going at, say, 2.5% a year if Europe is dragging along at 1%, and China continues to adhere to this state-directed development. There's only so much they can accomplish with these state-owned enterprises. Everybody's very fearful about Huawei, but in reality, a lot of the Chinese economy is hitting the wall in a lot of ways. At home, because of the continuing issues over immigration, we don't have the kind of, because we're up against the constraint of a fixed amount of labor. So there are things out there that are troubling. A lot of misguided policy in Europe, negative interest rates and so forth, I think are not terribly helpful. I don't think they're stimulative at all.
So you mentioned briefly the trade war, but it sounds like what you're saying is that you don't really think it's a trade war per se that's going to cause the biggest problem, in spite of its effects on farming here in the country and manufacturing and some other industries. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Chinese are buying less natural gas, so they're buying it from someplace else, and we're selling other people the natural gas. The natural gas exports are really big. Farm prices are down, but they're not, dramatically down. My feeling is that there are basic problems in the global economy, which has caused the kind of nationalist backlash we see in Europe and in the United States, and those are not getting addressed. In addition, the fractious nature of Washington keeps us, for example, from getting some fiscal stimulus, which is we really need now. The Fed cutting interest rates is not going to do a lot of good.
So, and that's interesting. Do you think, last time we'd spoken, you said, the Fed staying status quo is probably a good thing. Do you still think the Fed should stay status quo, or do you think that they should continue this course now that they've started dropping interest rates, at least federal funds rates?
Well, they have to cut interest rates in September this month, simply because everybody expects it. And they're under pressure to cut them further because of the interest rate differential with Europe and the strength of the dollar. It seems as though the Europeans and the Chinese are both playing a cheap currency game to push up the value of the dollar, which is hampering our exports. We're kind of engaged in a competitive devaluation here, like we did in the 1930s, and it's not healthy. But these are not things that are made in America, though the people that run the American economy or that are responsible for it are going to get the blame. I think this is going to be a tough economy for Trump to run on.
So how about, in the minute we have left in the segment, how about the flat yield curve, that what we saw through the end of August, beginning of September, where the yield curve literally became inverted? You weren't concerned about that last May. Things are different now. Is that one of the reasons the Fed should continue lowering short-term rates, perhaps?
No, I don't think that's the reason they should continue lowering short-term rates. And I don't think that the inverted yield curve is going to cause a recession. And 6 months ago, 4 months ago, it was really not indicative of trouble. Now, it's kind of coincidental. I think that we would be in trouble whether the yield curve was positively sloped or negatively sloped. But there are dangers out there. The economy is solid right now, but it wouldn't take much to knock it off its pedestal.
So when you take a quick commercial break, Peter, when we come back, I want to ask you about some of those dangers, and I want to focus specifically on the economy right here in the United States, and some recent indicators that say it might be cooling down just a tad. So stay with us, please. And you stay with us also. We'll be back here with much more in terms of words of wisdom from our good friend, Peter Morici, on the income generation. We'll be back in a moment. And now let's welcome back our friend, guest economist, Peter Morici. So Peter, as promised, let's talk about the economy here. We know we've been kind of sort of, as of late, the cleanest dirty shirt in the world's economic hamper. But ultimately, you throw a clean shirt in the hamper, the other shirts are going to get the clean shirt dirty. So is that what's happening to us a little bit?
A little bit. Investment spending is weak, and it's going to continue to be weak. And again, folks are focusing on the trade war. But one of the things we need to recognize is that the U.S. economy, as are all Western economies, are becoming fundamentally less capital intensive. You know, the automobile industry is not going to get any bigger. And if you want to sell another, 300 copies of Microsoft Windows, you don't have to build another 300,000 copies of Microsoft Windows. You don't have to build another factory. If you want to sell another 350,000 F-150s, you do. And we're not in the mode of building factories anymore. Building out artificial intelligence is fairly cheap. So one of the reasons businesses don't invest a lot of money these days is because they simply don't need to make more goods and services. The other thing is consumer spending is fairly robust, but all this negative chatter on the political scene, oh, we're worried about a recession and this and that, you can talk yourself into being sick.
So,
and I'm a little concerned that way because consumers have very good balance sheets right now.
But do you think that's finally affecting consumer spending? You think that chatter is finally affecting consumer spending? Because I know it was strong. We spoke a few months ago. It's fairly strong now. But do you think we're at that tipping point where the media is going to affect it?
I don't know. It's hard to say. But I do know that this constant negative drumbeat. Larry Summers, the esteemed Harvard economist who's managed to get himself fired in several places, and who advised us to get rid of Glass-Steagall, is now the sage of the economics profession on the front page of the Wall Street Journal outlining why he's concerned. So that in turn gets all the people who heard back and forth on news one day and another on the stocks with regard to trade talks getting worried. And in turn, we're starting to see that in small business optimism. We're seeing it in consumer sentiment and so forth. So the sentiment indicators seem to be running ahead of the actual spending. But if we look at household fundamentals, we are the one Western economy that's not overborrowed. In fact, our household balance sheets are in much better shape than they were before the Great Recession. And the big debt that we have is student debt, which doesn't have to be paid off tomorrow morning. So my feeling is that consumers can get it done. The question is, will they continue to do it? And that's not a question really an economist can do. It's more like you need a psychiatrist.
Right. True. Sad but true. So you talk about business sentiment being down a little bit. In the minute or so we have left, what do you think is most important for the Federal Reserve to do? If it's not necessarily lowering rates much further, what's important for them to do in order to gain that sentiment back in the business community so we can get some investment?
Well, I don't think that traditional tools will work very well. I think they have to cut interest rates because it's expected. I don't know that we need to restart quantitative easing, but I do need to think that they need to look at Libra and electronic money and providing consumers and businesses with money directly as opposed to through banks so that they would have better control on how liquidity gets into the system. Right now, they give it to banks. Banks sit on it essentially because they pay interest on their reserves. I think that they need to make some basic changes in how their policy tools are structured.
Sure, and they need to make sure they're clear and succinct in their language so business owners know what they can expect in the future.
Well, I think they've been pretty clear. I think Peter, Powell's been effective that way.
10 seconds. 10 seconds. Do you think we'll see negative interest rates at some point in our country in the next 5 or 10 years?
No, I don't believe so. I think that there would be an enormous backlash against that. And I think it is turning out to be a very foolish experiment in Europe. Negative interest rates is sort of like a steroid shot.
I agree 100% with that. It's been a foolish experiment. Peter, unfortunately, we need to leave it there. We are out of time. Thanks so much for being back with us here on The Income Generation.
Take care.
All right, and you stay with us too. We'll be back here in a minute. I'm David Scranton, and you're watching The Income Generation.